Today I'm going to be changing the infamous oil pump bolt on the Td5 Discovery 2. You will need some good quality oil. Both the oil filters, that's the centrifugal, that's the cartridge type. Some good tools, something to take the wheels off with. A jack, or two, even better. Axle stands, some WD-40, something to catch the oil in, some thread lock, or the replacement bolt, which has the thread lock on it. A new gasket for the sump, and a large piece of cardboard. A diagram explaining the sequence of undoing and removing the sump bolts. Some high temperature oil resistant sealant, a torque wrench, and optionally some cleaner materials. So the basis of this method is to take the wheels off, jack up the chassis as high as you can, lower down the axle, and that'll give you enough room to do the job. And that's it. So let's whip these wheels off. I'm jacking up the front crossmember so that I can place the axle stand under here, and then jack up the suspension to get the wheels off. Okay, so you can see how low the axle is in comparison to the body now. That should give me plenty of room to take off the sump without any issues. So now I'm going to remove the crossmember. 4 bolts on each side, 10mm. Now that the crossmember's out of the way, I'm going to drain the oil. While the oil is draining, I'm going to remove the filters. So what I've got is a screwdriver and a hammer. I'm just going to feed the screwdriver to the top of the filter by the sill and just give it a couple of taps. Oh, that slipped off. And the reason I'm doing that is just to loosen the sill, because these are incredibly difficult to get off. It is a terrible placement for an oil filter. Let's put that up there. Another bad thing about these oil filters is because of where they are, you've got to tip them to get them out. So you can put some rags under there, but I bought a plastic bag. Obviously make sure it's not the type with the holes at the bottom. And I'm just going to wrap a plastic bag around it as I take it out. Alright, so it's in a plastic bag now, so take it off. Tip it any way I want, just take it out in a bag. It saves spilling oil down there because you're going to be working under there later. So you don't want it covered in oil, because then as you're working it's just going to be dripping on your face for the next half hour. So plastic bag or some rags, whatever you want to do, but this worked. Okay, now I'm going to do the centrifugal filter. It's held in place by 2 11mm bolts. Let's get the torch on there. There's one. There's the other one right next to the main oil filter. You're going to want to take this breather pipe off first before you can get the cap off. Just pinch that, pull it back, give it a wiggle. There we go. Okay, I can tell already these are way too tight. This is a cast aluminium housing. So I think the torque setting for these is about 7 or 8 Newton meters. Any more than that and you risk stripping the threads. And then you'll need to change the housing. And that is not a fun job. That is, it's difficult to access as it is. Changing the housing, yeah, you don't want to be doing that. Little bit fiddly, but there's your centrifugal filter. So let's get that swapped over. There's a seal here that goes around the edge, so just watch out for that, don't lose it. Lift the old filter out, like so. If I put my finger in here, this is, I don't need to, This is like sludge. Okay, time for the new filter. I'm gonna do the cartridge first. There's no point trying to fill it with oil because as soon as you try and put it on, you're just gonna tip all of that on the floor. So spin it until it makes contact with the seal, and then give it another 3/4 of a turn. Drop the new filter in. So the max torque setting on these, I've just read, is 10 Newton-meters. My torque wrench only goes down to 20 Newton-meters. So I am just gonna nip them up very lightly. I'm just gonna go until, you know, I think that will do. Using just one finger, and you know, if it's not tight enough, it'll leak. And I will just gradually do them up until they stop leaking. But having to come back and redo these is much better than having to come back and get a new filter housing. And now stick that hose back on. So the oil's finished draining now. Time to get the sump off. 8, a 10 and a 13mm spanner, 10mm socket and a 13mm socket. So the first bolt to undo is the 8mm, and this is from the gearbox oil cooler. It's the pipe that runs down to the gearbox by the sump and just attaches on with this P-clip. So that's an 8mm. And stick the bolt back in there loosely so I don't lose it. Okay, moving round to the right hand side of the engine, there is a 10mm bolt, sorry, a 10mm nut, connecting that pipe to another. This is a downpipe from the Centrifugal oil filter. Again, 10mm. These could be either bolts or nuts, depending on your car. I'm actually just gonna leave them on ever so loosely, because this pipe will help support the sump when I take off all the bolts. So when I'm down to that last bolt, I'll undo these. They'll be finger tight, and it should just make it a little bit easier to get it off without the sump falling on my face. In theory. There are 4 bolts that attach to the back of the sump. 1, 2, 3, 4 to the gearbox. Take these ones off first. They're a 13mm. So this is where the pizza box comes in handy. Those 4 bolts that I just took out, the horizontal ones, all the same size, doesn't matter which order you take them out. The rest of the bolts, however, the bolts that face vertical on the sump, they need to be taken off in a specific order. There is a loosening and a tightening sequence for them. As you can see, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, basically round in a circle. And there are 3 or 4 different sizes. So it's important that you make a note of whereabouts they go, and then you'll put them back in the right place. And the best way to do that is to draw out the shape of the sump on a piece of cardboard and punch holes next to each number and stick the bolts in there, and that'll really help you when it comes to putting them back on. So you're going to want your 10mm socket on a small extension. I've got the diagram here on the iPad just to make it a little bit easier for me so I don't have to lean over at my piece of cardboard. But this diagram is taken from a bird's eye view. In other words, if you place the piece of cardboard directly underneath the sump, the bolt holes are going to line up as they would on the cardboard. So if I go to bolt number 1, that's the one in this corner up here. This is bolt 1, this is bolt 9, just to give you reference. So let's start with bolt number 1. For bolt number 2, you'll need to pull this pipe to one side. That's the one we removed first, that P-clip. So I've left bolt 19. I cracked it off, but left it in there finger tight, and then took off bolt 20. Just as I was taking off bolt 20, the sump dropped. So luckily, bolt 19 and those two studs that I left in earlier from the downpipe from the centrifugal oil filter are now holding the sump in place. So yeah, it's important that you leave them in, otherwise the sump is literally just gonna drop on your face. It's just got really dark because a thunderstorm has just opened up ahead. I didn't realise that was gonna happen, so it's started raining and it's lovely. So now I'm gonna try to take the sump off. This pipe here was stopping me from lowering the sump down low enough so that I could gain access to that oil pump sprocket bolt. So I had to undo, it was 3 in total. There's another one just around there, coming under the front of the car. This is your famous bolt. It's definitely not hand tight, but I'm very curious how tight it is. I'm just gonna wipe that off. Right, so what I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna whip this bolt off. I'm gonna clean it up, I'm gonna put some thread lock on it and then re-tighten it. This is a sump in the lowest configuration that you'll be able to get it. And although you can't get it off completely, there's more than enough room to clean it up and get the new gasket on. And there's more than enough room to get up here into the sprocket bolt. Okay, so just to give you an idea of how much room there is, I can quite easily stick my leg in under that. So the idea is to get out as much dirty oil as you can while you've got the chance. That way you're not reusing dirty oil. Of course, if you take the sump off completely using the other method, you can clean it out a bit more thoroughly. But for another 5%, I can't really justify spending the extra time taking off all those extra bits and risking damaging them as well. Okay, so now for the sprocket bolt. And you need a 10mm socket to take off the sprocket bolt. Give it a nice generous blob. So the torque setting for this is 25 Newton meters. Just be careful I don't knock the sprocket off because it is loose now. So when it comes to installing the new gasket, you're going to have to make sure it's the right way round. It's got these locating studs all around it. At the bell housing end, you need the studs to face up. See, there's no studs there. That's the stud facing up. At the oil pump end, you need the stud facing down. That's how it's going to go. That's how you're going to lay it onto the sump. So basically this is the top. So just going to give the mating face of the cylinder block a quick wipe with a cloth, making sure that I don't knock any dust or dirt into the sump. Okay, the gasket is installed dry, so I'm just going to feed that on over here. Check that the gasket is seated properly. I'm going to put the easiest ones in first, just to give me a bit of a head start. Let's go for this one because I can see it. Right, okay, so that's all of the bolts in now. I'm just going to go around with a ratchet and just nip them up until they're flush, and then I can go around and torque them in the correct sequence. That's all the main bolts done. So now it's just the 4 at the back here, they get tightened to 13 Newton meters. And then we've got a oil filter drain tube. They need tightening into 10 Newton meters. In goes the crossmember. Don't forget to check that the sump plug is tight before getting the car off the axle stands and onto flat level ground. Only one thing left to do.